When I was a child, I would visit a friend who lived far away. We would play video games together, a treat for me since I didn't own a gaming system myself. One day, he introduced me to a mysterious show unlike the other ones I watched at the time. For one thing, I had to read what the characters were saying. For another, it was dark, gritty, and mature. It wasn't what I was used to. Dragon Ball Z, one of my favorite shows at the time, definitely had its share of violence, but I never felt the characters were in danger. Goku and friends would win the fight, and even if they didn't, they would live in the afterlife and could always be resurrected. But this new show was different. I felt I was seeing an adult and mature story for the first time. A story with consequences, where the characters could lose, suffer tragedy, and even die. It had a significant effect on me. That show was Fullmetal Alchemist. In this video, I will explore the strengths, weaknesses, and themes of the original Fullmetal Alchemist from 2003, the second adaptation, Brotherhood, and how the two shows differ. I'll avoid spoilers when possible, but this video will cover major plot details of both shows. For those who want a quick summary up front, my thoughts are as follows. The original 2003 show is a great story in its own right despite significantly diverging from the source material. When comparing it to Brotherhood, I prefer its aesthetics, music, and pacing, and I think it ultimately tells a better story. The two movies made following the end of each series, Conqueror of Shambhala and Sacred Star of Milos, don't add anything to either show and aren't worth viewing. If you haven't seen the original 2003 show, I highly recommend it. It was once famously said that a special effect without a story is a pretty boring thing. I'd expand that quote to include action in general. Car chases, shootouts, and CGI monsters can be fun and exciting, but if they're unmotivated, that is, not in service to a story and its themes, they're boring and meaningless. Stories, whatever their purpose, whether they're trying to be entertaining, teach us lessons, or make us think, are ultimately about emotionally connecting with an idea or character. Think about your favorite stories and why they're your favorites. For me, they're the ones that made me contemplate ideas, re-examine my beliefs, where I connected with a character, the stories that had an emotional impact on me. So I'm happy to report that not only does 2003's Fullmetal Alchemist have plenty of exciting action scenes, they're always in service to its story, characters, and themes. Themes are what tie everything together. Fullmetal Alchemist examines science, religion, desperation, the brutality of war, the harsh truths of reality, what it means to be human, and how people create their own demons. The story takes place in a country aesthetically and culturally inspired by Victorian-era Europe, mainly Germany. Technology mostly matches that of the late 1800s, but a magical power called alchemy exists. Alchemists use transmutation to change an object into anything else so long as their components are of the same quantity and type. This is called the law of equivalent exchange. For example, alchemy can be used to instantly repair a broken radio since the radio's components are the same, just in a different arrangement, but can't be transformed into a larger radio or a tree. We follow the teenage Elric brothers, Ed and Al, on their adventures as they search for the Philosopher's Stone, a legendary item said to hold great power, including the ability to ignore the law of equivalent exchange. They believe the stone's power will allow them to restore their original bodies, which were destroyed in an alchemical mishap. Along the way, they experience traumatic events, tragedy, loss, and begin to uncover terrible secrets behind the mythical stone and events connected to it. Rather than starting at the beginning, the series' first two episodes initially show the brothers on one of their later adventures confronting the power-hungry priest Father Cornello in a foreign city, before rewinding to the beginning. I think this works well as it serves to start things on a simpler, more action-focused setup rather than front-load the story with excessive information and lore. It also serves to foreshadow the series' main antagonists, the homunculi, since they don't have direct involvement with the brothers' early lives. Father Cornello possesses what appears to be a Philosopher's Stone and is using its seemingly miracle-working powers to recruit followers. He even promises them he can revive their dead loved ones. Despite being magical, alchemy is governed by strict rules, with alchemists being equivalent to scientists. Ed even has a discussion with devout hopeful Rose in which he espouses atheism and the idea that human beings are made of nothing more than their physical components. Rose refuses to acknowledge Ed as, aside from going against her beliefs in general, it would mean that Cornell's promise to resurrect her dead lover is a lie. However, science and reason are not portrayed as infallible virtues. Ed's missing limbs and Al's hollow body are the result of their own miscalculated hubris and naivete. Alchemists are not all-knowing wise men and lack a lot of important knowledge about the world. The story's most horrific events are instigated by the research and application of alchemy, namely war and human experimentation. Once Cornello is dealt with, we rewind to 11 and 10-year-old Ed and Al who live in the countryside with their mother. Their long-absent father, Hohenheim, left when they were infants and hasn't been in contact since. Supposedly a skilled alchemist, the boys follow in his footsteps, teaching themselves alchemy by reading the books he left behind. When their mother falls ill and dies, the brothers become de facto orphans and they resolve to resurrect her with alchemy despite the practice being forbidden. They reason that since a human is made of physical components like anything else, they should be able to create a new body for her as long as they procure matching materials. They seek out an alchemy teacher to learn more for their coming attempt and return roughly 1 year later. Still young and naive, they don't realize why tampering with life and death is taboo. The scene where Ed and Al try to bring their mother back to life is one of the most haunting and emotionally resonant parts of any story I've witnessed. Reflecting on the series now, that first time seeing it as a child at my friend's house, I can no longer recall my friend's face, but I still vividly remembered that scene almost 2 decades later. Ed and Al's bodies are disintegrated by an unknown force as they fruitlessly struggle and cry out for each other. Ed finds himself transported to a mysterious void where a layer of darkness reveals numerous eyes staring at him through an ominous doorway. In a desperate attempt to save his brother, Ed offers one of his arms in exchange for binding Al's soul to a nearby suit of armor. When things finally settle, Ed is missing his right arm and left leg, Al's original body is gone, and their mother has been revived, but only as a barely living, twisted ghoul. Family, friends, and neighbors Pinocchio and Winry take in the two boys and outfit Ed with prosthetic automale limbs, which can be controlled like real limbs. While anachronistic, I can accept automale as a technology in this world because it's logically consistent and doesn't break the plot. What's harder to swallow is Al's empty body that can see, speak, and hear despite not having eyes, ears, or a mouth, which doesn't require energy to continue functioning indefinitely. Alchemy is a well thought out and well crafted magic system, but Al represents a part of the story that sidesteps it. Even so, contrivances can be worthwhile if they lead to something interesting. In Al's case, I think they do. A lot of intriguing interactions and character development occur as a result of Al's fake body. He has to hide his true nature from others. He's unable to experience touch or taste. He feels lonely at night since everyone else sleeps but his body is unable to. Later in the story, he has an existential crisis in which he questions if he was ever a real person to begin with, since it's not inconceivable that Ed could have fabricated his personality and memories using alchemy to replace the real Al who died. For his part, Ed has been feeling guilty for years, blaming himself for the loss of Al's body and wondering if Al also blames him. After their failed human transmutation, Ed and Al abandon any hope of resurrecting their mother and decide they should instead look to restore their original bodies. While technically not parentless, their absent father is so estranged from them that Ed doesn't even consider looking for him. Being the older of the two brothers, Ed vaguely remembers their father leaving and blames him for their mother's death. The boys are met by state alchemist Roy Mustang, who's come on behalf of the military in search of their father. He puts them on the path to becoming state alchemists themselves, with the promise of accessing the government's vast library of research regarding the Philosopher's Stone. Armed with a new goal, the boys decide to burn down their house, removing a home to return to as they say there's no turning back. I don't think this choice makes much sense, especially considering all of their property burns including their father's alchemy books, though I can understand the idea of wanting to be driven and not get complacent. It strikes me as more of their short-sighted, bad decision-making. Ed and Al have a number of fun and tragic adventures as young boys before and after passing the state alchemy exam, but the one to highlight is the saga of Shao Tucker. The brothers temporarily live with single father Shao Tucker, also known as the Sewing Life Alchemist, along with his daughter Nina and their pet dog. The field of alchemy is well developed regarding transmuting objects, but not in changing living beings. Tucker is famous for creating a chimera, a hybrid creature made by combining different animals, which could understand and speak the human language. Unfortunately, since accomplishing this feat, he hasn't been able to reproduce his work a second time, and the government is threatening to revoke his status if he does poorly on his upcoming annual review. Viewers can pick up on subtle and not so subtle hints about what's really going on. Tucker is finally able to make another chimera in time for his review, a moment that quickly turns to horror for both Ed and the audience once the truth is revealed.
ちゃん。
Ed deduces that Tucker used alchemy to combine Nina and their dog together, effectively killing both of them. His wife, whom we were told left him and their daughter due to their poverty at the time, was actually transmuted into the first chimera he created. Tucker valued status and a comfortable lifestyle over the lives of his family. He also reveals himself to be a sociopath by stating that he transformed his daughter just to see if he could, wanting to test the limits of his alchemy. I do question how he thought he could get away with killing his daughter, but I ascribe it to his desperation and the fact that he had gotten away with the same thing previously. This folly of hubris is similar to how Ed and Al, along with many others, attempted to resurrect their dead loved ones. The brothers were young children, but for the adults, how did they convince themselves it would work? Surely there would be success stories. My conclusion is those people labored in denial, deluded by hope, and desperately convinced themselves it would work. Their desperation led them to ignore every warning sign and pursue a foolhardy undertaking to their own detriment. The chimera scene is probably the most famous moment in Fullmetal Alchemist. It's an emotional gut punch for the viewer, and it's not the only one. Passing the state alchemist exam means becoming subservient to the state, a so-called dog of the military, as many characters put it, able to be called upon in times of war in order to kill. Roy Mustang points out that if Al's status as an empty suit of armor were to become widely known as a result of passing the exam, then he would be treated as a lab rat. Ed sees getting their hands on exclusive government research as the only way for them to track down the Philosopher's Stone, so he agrees to pass the exam for both of them. In practical terms, even if Al isn't technically a state alchemist, he'll still follow his brother to the ends of the earth, so they're both effectively signing away their freedom. So far, I've mostly spoken about the Elric brothers since they're the main characters, but there are a number of other important figures who play prominent roles in the story and act as vessels for its themes. Roy Mustang is a high-ranking official in the military and has a personal history with the Elric brothers. He's Ed's handler and his most direct face-to-face superior. Roy is a somewhat enigmatic character for much of the series, as it's unclear how committed he is to his military position and exactly where his loyalties lie. He often gets into conflict with Ed as his calculated methods abrade Ed's hot-blooded attitude. Ed has no real loyalty to the military since he's only using his position to gain information, whereas Roy is a lifelong soldier. At one point they even engage in a mock battle and Roy finger blasts Ed. No, that can't be right. They engage in a mock battle and Roy fire blasts Ed. Sorry about that. We later learn about Roy's participation in the Ishbalan War of Extermination, a conflict in which the military waged a campaign of genocide on an ethnic group within their own borders. Having been involved in a war he considers unjust, in which he personally killed civilians, Roy wants to reform the military. He bears the sins of his past, but he's not actively seeking redemption. He abides the military's regulations, but bends the rules and does what he can to affect positive outcomes. He's a complex character who can't be boiled down to any one philosophy or mindset. The Ishbalan man, known only as Scar due to his distinct facial wounds, is a ruthless religious warrior who wants to exact personal and cultural revenge on behalf of his people by killing every state alchemist, including Ed. Scar is effectively a terrorist, but while we're initially opposed to him since he's after Ed and Al and killing people, we later learn about the atrocities committed by the military against the Ishbalan people and against Scar personally. The military indiscriminately killed civilians, sometimes for no reason other than to field test new alchemy-based weapons or for the individual sadistic desires of madmen. Scar's face was disfigured by the Crimson Alchemist Kimbley shortly before he killed Scar's own brother right in front of him. Scar's actions aren't justified, but they are understandable. The Ishbal storyline also serves to reinforce themes of science, religion, and desperation. The Ishbalan religion teaches that alchemy is the domain of God and forbidden to humans. Any Ishbalans who practice it are outcast. The alchemically inclined military is morally in the wrong for attacking them, but the Ishbalan religion's rejection of alchemy makes them weaker and easier to subjugate. Then, as the Ishbalans are badly losing the war, they hypocritically turn to their former outcast's alchemy for help out of desperation. Hughes initially appears to be a simple character, but he wears many hats. A fellow soldier, he's lighthearted and outgoing. His introductory scene tells us almost everything we need to know about him. 妊娠してからなんだかますます綺麗になっちゃってなあなあこれで明日生まれちゃったらもうどうするヒューズその話は50回くらい聞いたそんな話だったら俺に電話してないで女房に直接しろなんていうの地上に舞い降りた天使みたい Ed and Al spend a significant amount of time with him and his family, and he's longtime friends with Roy. Hughes is an overly doting father and husband, is well liked by his military comrades, and is far more perceptive and shrewder than he first seems. He's also the source of the show's second emotional gut punch. Hughes uncovers that the military has been infiltrated by rogue elements and gets attacked to keep the secret under wraps. While hurriedly attempting to contact Roy, this happens. 勝利には泣きぼくろがあるんだよ。そうだっけ。うっかりしてたよ。I think this is a pretty small detail to notice and an even bigger leap to make, especially given his frantic state at the time, but it's not impossible. Confronting the disguised homunculus turns out to be a big mistake as Envy kills him to keep his mouth shut. One of the things I love about this is how Roy, even though he eventually assists in dealing with the homunculus threat, never gets to personally exact direct revenge against Envy or even meet him. The show isn't afraid to present unfortunate, honest truths. Sometimes good people fail and die before they achieve their purpose. Sometimes bad people succeed and are never punished. There's often a lack of closure. Some tragedies come out of nowhere and others are from demons of our own making. Ed and Al encounter numerous enemies throughout the series like Scar and the military at large, but their most formidable foes are the homunculi. A group of inhuman beings, they're the ones pulling the strings behind the scenes. Not being human, they're incapable of using alchemy, but they can regenerate their bodies from seemingly any injury. Additionally, they have unique abilities distinct from one another, all having something to do with altering their bodies, such as Envy's shapeshifting. I like how their abilities are tied together with a common theme governed by rules, rather than being the random X-Men powers many fantasy series crudely implement. The homunculi are ageless beings created from failed human transmutations and are named after the 7 deadly sins. I think the 7 deadly sins concept works well here because their finite nature creates intrigue. My first time watching the series, I wondered who the next homunculus or sin would be, and what unique power they'd have. The twisted versions of resurrected loved ones, they generally lack morals or compassion, though they do retain some essence of their original selves. They personify the idea of human beings creating their own demons. The true agenda of the homunculi remains unknown for a long time, though we do know they're manipulating events and have some connection to the Philosopher's Stone. We're eventually told that they want a Philosopher's Stone so that they can become human, though this isn't completely true. More on that later. Throughout the brothers' journey, they encounter many people also seeking the stone's supposed legendary power. Ed and Al also find numerous examples of imperfect stones which possess incredible power but are limited in scale and break after finite use. It turns out the crystal alchemist Dr. Marco already discovered the secret to creating Philosopher's Stones some time ago, but he refuses to share his knowledge with Ed and Al. Marco is a deserter who fled the battlefield in Ishbal due to his guilt for having engaged in human experimentation and causing civilian massacres. He worries that if anyone gets their hands on a Philosopher's Stone, it will lead to more of the same. However, he does take pity on the Elric brothers and gives them a lead on his findings. After tracking down and decoding his research, the brothers learn the terrible truth.
よくわかったぜ。悪魔の研究と言われるわけも、マルコさんが研究を捨てた理由もな、賢者の石の材料が生きた人間だなんて。
The stones they've been encountering up to this point have only been flawed in that an insufficient number of humans were used in their making. To create a true Philosopher's Stone, a great number of humans have to be sacrificed. Faced with what they consider to be morally unacceptable, the brothers once again abandon their current goal and are left aimless. It's not for long though, as they become wrapped up in a new dangerous chain of events. The brothers infiltrate a supposedly abandoned military-run alchemy lab and discover that they've been conducting human experiments on prisoners in an attempt to create a Philosopher's Stone. The homunculi present Ed with the opportunity to sacrifice the prisoners to create his own stone. In a moment of desperation and guilt for having trapped Al in a hollow body, he almost goes through with it, but he's ultimately unable to. Lacking direction and having seen the ugly side to the military, the brothers leave to meet their boyhood alchemy teacher Azumi. Her method of discipline borders on insane, but I'm positive about her overall. As young children, she isolates Ed and Al on an islet for a month with no survival training and sends a man to attack them, just in case their Lord of the Flies experience wasn't authentic enough. On the other hand, I like her design and she's a great character with a fantastic dynamic with the boys. Alchemy can only be performed by drawing a transmutation circle, but Ed is able to perform alchemy by clapping his hands together. This is attributed to him witnessing the gateway of truth after performing human transmutation on his mother. It's an ability he intuitively knows despite not being able to explain how or why it works, and Azumi has the same ability, as well as recurring fits of coughing up blood, both of which hint at her tragic past. In a heartbreaking flashback, we see her attempt to resurrect her stillborn son. Of course, it doesn't work and she loses some of her internal organs, but it shows how anyone, even the seasoned and world-weary Azumi, can succumb to the delusion of hope. This leads to an encounter with the homunculus Wrath and is where the show largely diverges from the source material. Wrath is a young-looking boy who, unlike the other homunculi, is capable of using alchemy. Having been isolated on the islet Ed and Al trained on years ago confirms his identity as the resurrected child of Azumi. Initially infantile and ignorant, Wrath quickly changes into another selfish, immoral, and sadistic homunculus like the rest. This creates interesting tension as Azumi is conflicted over whether to protect him or not. He's a monster, but he's also sort of her son and she's responsible for creating him. A recurring theme in the series is characters who want to atone for past sins. Izumi, Roy, and Marco are all characters who, in their own eyes, committed some kind of sin and harbor feelings of guilt. Izumi initially protects Wrath due to maternal feelings and remorse, but later feebly attempts to kill him. She even contemplates letting him kill her as a form of penance. Marco was similarly willing to allow Scar to kill him for revenge, and Roy contemplated killing himself, both for what they did in the war. None of them found peace in their self-flagellating remorse. That's because an unfortunate truth of life is that there's no making up for moral failures or rebalancing karmic scales. Life isn't about atonement or self-punishment, it's about putting one foot in front of the other and moving on from your past mistakes.
私たちにとって教師様の奇跡は希望だった。信じていれば死んだ人も蘇ることができる。それだけが私たちの希望だった。私は明日から何にすがって生きていけばいいの？
そんなこと自分で考えろ。立って歩け。前へ進め。あんたには立派な足がついてるじゃないか。
Eventually, the alchemist Dante is revealed to be the mastermind behind the homunculi and most of the series' major events. 400 years ago, Dante and Hohenheim were lovers who sought immortality. They were able to achieve this by repeatedly transferring their consciousnesses into other people's bodies using the power of the Philosopher's Stone created by sacrificing a great number of humans. Hohenheim, having ostensibly renounced this practice, tells Dante that there's no such thing as eternal life and that their bodies will continuously deteriorate even if they switch to new ones, as their souls are not similarly renewed. He reveals that he left his family because he didn't want them to see him slowly wither away. I find his reasoning dubious, as even after 15 years he still appears able-bodied and capable of easily hiding his condition. He could have remained a husband and father to his sons despite his body's deterioration, but it at least provides an explanation for his absence. Meanwhile, Dante has been orchestrating wars by strategically placing her homunculi underlings in key locations to ignite conflict in an attempt to create a Philosopher's Stone. The idea is that people driven to despair by war will seek power by creating a stone. It would also be difficult to engineer a situation where great masses of people could be sacrificed for the creation of a stone without drawing attention or opposition. Thus, war is the means of opportunity. The homunculi would swoop in at the last minute and steal the stone from any human who creates one. Dante created the homunculi by traveling to the scene of failed human transmutations and feeding the resurrected creations imperfect philosopher's stones so that they could generate a body instead of rotting away. The homunculi make for great underlings as they are powerful, difficult to kill, and lack the moral compassion of humans. Lust claims the homunculi are working for Dante because they want her to use the Philosopher's Stone to make them human. However, the homunculi themselves are as different from each other as humans are, with many disparate motivations. I think most of them are conflicted about their nature, with some driven more by resentment of humanity and a nebulous desire for revenge. The final encounter takes place in a great underground ruin, an apocalyptic tombstone for a dead civilization implied to have been destroyed by Dante and Hohenheim. A battle takes place and eventually culminates in a one-on-one fight between Ed and the shape-shifting homunculus Envy. Envy holds a special hatred for Hohenheim and his children as he's the resurrected child of Hohenheim and was abandoned by him. Ed is dealt a fatal blow, so Al uses the power of the Philosopher's Stone to save his brother's life, but this leaves his own life in a tenuous state. When Ed comes to, he accesses the Gateway of Truth to retrieve Al's body and is transported through it. Ed awakens in a new world and learns from Hohenheim that they are in 20th century London. His father explains that the world of Fullmetal Alchemist and the real world are separate universes and that alchemy doesn't exist in the real world. The reason alchemy works in their world is that the energy from dying humans passes through the Gateway of Truth and is what enables transmutation on the other side. He states that the two worlds were essentially the same until alchemy caused the two timelines to diverge. Al's original body is restored, but he loses all of the memories he accumulated since he originally lost his body. Roy fights and defeats the homunculus Bradley, thus ending the homunculus' control of the military. It's not explicitly shown, but it's heavily implied that Dante is killed by gluttony in a mindless frenzy, a frenzy she caused, and another example of people's actions leading to their own demise. Separated from each other, Ed and Al resolve to find a way to be reunited. Now that I've recapped the ending, I want to speak about the actual storytelling in Fullmetal Alchemist before moving on. I think it's complexly satisfying. There are often multiple different plotlines being told simultaneously in any given episode, and many characters are introduced before they're immediately relevant. Events span multiple episodes and aren't confined to being introduced and paid off immediately. The show wisely avoids many genre conventions and anime cliches. There are no training arcs, and characters don't level up or inexplicably receive new, special powers. The Elric brothers instead defeat their enemies by conducting research, methodically gathering information, and learning new concepts. Ed and Al, though shown to be teenage prodigies, are not more capable than the adults around them. In fact, the opposite is usually true. They're often outclassed and less knowledgeable than the people they meet, and are at multiple points assigned military escorts to guard them from Scar. Even though they're involved in and have connections to most major events, the world doesn't revolve around them. Despite this, the story still falls victim to a number of cliches, regrettable tropes, and flawed logic. Characters are shot at by machine gun fire, yet every bullet misses them, or worse, they're able to outrun the gunfire. Most alchemists can't transmute without first drawing a transmutation circle, so many of them get around this by wearing armbands or gloves with circles drawn on in advance, or by literally tattooing circles on their body. Yet this is the exception. You would think every alchemist would do this, but they don't. Alchemy is shown to be capable of causing very powerful effects, such as creating huge masses of stone spikes, yet characters often forgo these techniques and resort to risky, less effective hand-to-hand combat. Bigger story-related problems start to crop up as the series goes on. From the outset, Studio Bones planned to diverge from the manga's story and go in a different direction. I mostly like how the new story developed, but it's clear to me that things were becoming shaky towards the end. In later episodes, the show introduces too many new concepts too quickly, and it starts to feel overwhelming. There are a number of plot elements regarding the ending and background information which I don't think work well. I don't understand how Dante knew when and where human transmutations would take place, or how she arrived on the scene so quickly to create her homunculus minions. This seems like a plot hole. Having one of the villains return as a literal cyborg was too much for me. Automail was already pushing against the line of believability, but a battle robot blows right past it. The design looks stupid, and it also marks the third time that a villain believed dead returns in a new transformed body. Rose and her baby serve no real function in the later story, and I don't understand what purpose they were supposed to fill. Dante has one throwaway line about babies having a weak connection between body and soul. Meanwhile, Rose inexplicably stands around like a vacant-eyed zombie, allowing her baby to be threatened and manhandled. Dante even tells Rose to her face that she plans to use her as a new host body, and Rose doesn't react in any way. While it's possible that Dante could have used alchemy to enfeeble her somehow, this is never shown or hinted at. Hohenheim should have no way of knowing about the history of the real world, but even assuming he's correct, it makes no sense. The two worlds were allegedly the same until a historical divergence point when alchemy was discovered. This is supposed to explain why there are doppelgangers with the same name and face in each world, but we know that alchemy has been around for at least 400 years, yet parallel humans exist. Furthermore, the history and even geography of both worlds are different. Ed and Hohenheim even speak the same language as the people from an entirely different world. It doesn't make sense. But to me, the biggest flaw is Al losing all of his memories. Al grew and changed as a character. He had an incredible emotional journey. To have all of that wiped away feels like being cheated, a sort of it was all a dream, but for a single character. The way I understand it is that since Al's real body and soul were disconnected, when his real body returned, it didn't retain any of the memories from when he lived as a hollow suit of armor. But that's just my own headcanon. The Gateway of Truth isn't fully explained or understood, so there's no reason why it had to be written that way. But on the other hand, there are many more things I love about the ending. Something that didn't make sense to me throughout the series is the law of equivalent exchange. Even if you have the same components, surely the process of alchemy itself should require some kind of catalyst. This is presented as something you're supposed to hand-wave, and while it didn't need an explanation, I appreciate that it got one. Not everything is resolved all nice and tidy. Throughout the story, Ed and Al are always pursuing a mutual goal, but that goal changes as new information and obstacles present themselves. The ending continues this tradition, with the brothers now trying to reunite. Despite losing their leader, some of the homunculi are still around and are potential threats. Hohenheim doesn't die in a heroic moment of redemption, and the brothers don't get a set-in-stone happily ever after. Things feel bittersweet, hopeful but not saccharine. It's a complex, mature ending that's emotionally satisfying without feeling cheap. Before moving on, I want to speak briefly about the follow-up movie, Conqueror of Shambhala. My quick opinion is that while it does have a slightly more definitive conclusion than the TV series, it's not worth seeing and viewers should stop watching at the show's conclusion. Conqueror of Shambhala takes place after the events of the series, serving as a continuation and second ending. It seems like there were two main things the creators wanted to do with the movie: tie up every loose end from the series and pack in as much fan service as possible. The movie sees the brothers reunited and basically gives us the happily ever after ending we didn't get in the series. The remaining homunculi are all killed off. Characters we know from the series have their doppelgangers show up in the real world universe for fan service purposes and not for any story reason. Instead of morally gray antagonists, our heroes battle against literal black and white World War era German soldiers. There's a lot of on-the-nose exposition and recapping. Even though the real world is not supposed to have alchemy, various magics are used, including a Romani woman with inexplicable fortune-telling powers. From a production standpoint, everything still looks and sounds great, but from a story perspective, it's filled with pointless nonsense, bad fan service, and is an unnecessary continuation of the original ending. There's a problem that presents itself when adapting a story from unfinished source material. What happens when you outpace the original story? In the case of the original Fullmetal Alchemist, Studio Bones opted to take an entirely different route. Director Seiji Mizushima said in an interview that Fullmetal Alchemist was planned from the beginning to have an original story with the source material serving as a framework. Quote, "When we started the Fullmetal Alchemist anime adaptation, there were only 1 or 2 volumes out during that time, so when I started the project, there wasn't pressure to be faithful to the original story. It was more about creating an original story that would last a full season." I think this worked out very well. However, many weren't satisfied that the source material hadn't been faithfully adapted. 5 years after the original series ended, Studio Bones returned to adapt it again, adding Brotherhood to the title to differentiate it from the 2003 series, with plans to stick to the manga's story this time. So I find it very surprising that the first episode of Brotherhood is new anime original content. Despite this, the rest of Brotherhood begins more or less as the first show did. In the new story, rather than Dante, the main antagonist is Father, a centuries-old supernatural creature originating from beyond the mortal realm, who assumes the likeness of Hohenheim. Rather than immortality, Father wants to create a new Philosopher's Stone to obtain ultimate power and freedom, though he's already the most powerful person in the world and it doesn't seem like anyone's impeding him. The homunculi are Father's magically created underlings and have nothing to do with human transmutation. The military, instead of only being influenced by Bradley, has been entirely co-opted by corrupt higher-ups. Sloth and Wrath don't exist and are replaced by entirely different characters. Now, many things happen over the course of the story, but it's no exaggeration to say that most of them don't matter. The broad strokes are that Father, the homunculi, and the military at large are the bad guys, and the good guys have to gather allies to defeat them. The story ends on a cheerful note with all of the villains defeated and nearly every heroic character getting a happy ending. Sacred Star of Milos, a movie made after the show, is a side story that takes place at some point midway through the series. My advice is to skip it. It has multiple nonsensical plot twists and introduces new alchemy powers that contradict the established rules. There's a noticeable change in art style, with the quality suffering considerably in some scenes. Being a side story, it has no impact whatsoever on the original plot and is mostly inoffensive and pointless. Now that both series have finished, the consensus among the general public seems to be that the original series is fine, but that Brotherhood is the superior version. The website MyAnimeList is an anime, social networking, and cataloging site where users can rate and review anime. At the time of this video's release, Brotherhood is the highest rated anime on the site, whereas the original 2003 series is ranked at number 376. There are some problems with using these metrics. MyAnimeList is only one website and caters to a primarily Western audience. But while not a strictly scientific measurement, it is a good barometer. When someone who hasn't seen Fullmetal Alchemist has recommended it, it's usually Brotherhood they're referred to. The 2003 show was planned to be its own original story from the beginning. I think a story should stand on its own strengths, so I will not be comparing the two shows based on how faithfully they adapt the source material, but rather on their individual merits. Before I continue, I want to clarify that negativity is not something I like to revel in. I don't approach new experiences wanting to dislike them. Even things I dislike have positive aspects and are produced by talented artists. So before getting into what will be a very long section of criticism, I'd like to briefly discuss what I do like about Brotherhood. The show's art, animation, and pacing significantly improve after its early episodes, and it generally looks and sounds great. I like some of the new characters and their designs, especially General Armstrong and Major Miles. I really like Mustang's fight scene against Lust, which looks fantastic. And I like some small details, such as Envy's true form being hinted at by his heavy weight. I also asked friends who do like the show what they enjoyed about it. The impressions I got were that Brotherhood appeals to people who enjoy its more upbeat tone, action-oriented focus, and grandiose plot. The ending ties up its loose threads rather than leaving them dangling. They also said they like the characters, their arcs, and the show's themes overall. But while I want to promote positivity, I do think flaws should be acknowledged and discussed. So with all that being said, Brotherhood has numerous significant problems which I feel make it not just inferior to the 2003 show, but mediocre in general. In preparation for this video, I rewatched both shows, of which I'd seen neither since their debuts, and all supplemental material including the movies, as well as read some of the manga. The first show was just as good as I remembered and was a treat to see again. Even now as I'm writing this, after having recently binged it, I still feel tempted to rewatch it. In contrast, sitting through Brotherhood was a slog. The major problems with Brotherhood are bad pacing, a lack of subtlety, poor story decisions, an overuse of cheap comedy that undermines tension, superfluous unnecessary story events and characters, and lackluster music. Tonally, the original show is somewhat darker, but that's not to say it's cynical, it simply portrays life honestly, warts and all. It has visually striking artwork, excellent animation, and overall composition, and it often looks better than many anime produced today. Its only drawback, technically speaking, is the unfortunate 4:3 aspect ratio. By contrast, Brotherhood is overly upbeat and the early episodes often look flat and sketchy. Characters are drawn doughier, with more rounded, childlike faces instead of the sharper look of the 2003 show. The early episode backgrounds often look unfinished. Many scenes lack the emotional direction and weight the original had. Adapting the manga for a second time created what I can imagine was an awkward situation where Studio Bones was redoing the same content they'd already made before. As a result, it feels like the studio was speedrunning the early episodes. Brotherhood takes what was covered by the original show in 28 episodes and condenses it down to just 12. It outright skips many story events, including some from the manga, and therefore loses a lot of the atmosphere and important setup for later. As I mentioned earlier, the first episode of Brotherhood is an anime original, meaning it had even less time to cover the material. The plot is rushed, introducing too many characters and too much information right away. The first series started by introducing the basics of alchemy, human transmutation, and the Philosopher's Stone along with 4 characters. It spread its information and characters over an introductory 2-part episode. Brotherhood introduces everything related to alchemy as well as various historical events and geopolitics, 9 characters, and crams it all into a single episode.
アイザック・マクドゥ元国家錬金術師イシュバール殲滅戦の時
もしかして君たちエルリック兄弟か。
これはマース・ヒューズ
妻のグレーシアと娘のエリシア。
このグレンの錬金術師が
国家錬金術師といえば
アレックス・レイ・アームストロンロイ・マスタング錬金術10日交換錬成神もなしオートメールからの鎧だ鎧に魂を定着させたというの錬金術師最大の禁忌人体錬成をや
The whole thing feels a bit like self-indulgent fan fiction, something which would have been more appropriate as a DVD extra rather than the starting point of the show. A die-hard fan of the series I spoke to said he always skips the first episode when rewatching it. It's bizarre, and I don't understand why Studio Bones chose to do things this way. The early episodes of the original series are important for setting up the world and themes and for the character growth of Ed and Al. I think it's important to go over what was changed or skipped and why it hurts the story. Episode 1 and 2, the brothers confront the corrupt priest Father Cornello. The 2-parter is condensed into one episode and moved to episode 3. Episodes 3 and 6, a flashback showing the boy's mother and Ed passing the state alchemy exam, rearranged and condensed into episode 2. Episode 4, the brothers stop at a small village where there are rumors of the dead attacking the living. The episode deals with themes of obsession and using alchemy for selfish and immoral purposes. Skipped. Episode 5, the brothers team up with Hughes to stop a train hijacking. This episode has a lot of fun and creative action set pieces, and it's one of my favorites in the whole show. Skipped. Episode 7, the Shao Tucker and Nina episode. Episode 6 also covers the characters, but both are condensed and moved to episode 4. Episode 8, a serial killer is on the loose in Central. It also deals with the aftermath of the previous episode. Skipped. Episode 9, the brothers are sent to investigate a coal mining town. This episode introduces the corrupt Commander Yoki, who plays a more prominent role in Brotherhood, but the events are only briefly mentioned there in one line. This episode forces Ed to confront his role as a state alchemist and dog of the military, where the interests of the state go against the townspeople and his own morals. Skipped. Episode 10, a flamboyant thief who uses alchemy has become a tourist attraction and the brothers are tasked with apprehending her. It shows how even criminals can do good and that people are morally complicated. Skipped. Episode 11 and 12, 2 alchemist brothers are impersonating Ed and Al while attempting to create a Philosopher's Stone, but the manufacturing process is poisoning their town. The brothers are a mirror to Ed and Al's relationship. Skipped. Episode 13, Ed and Roy have a very exciting mock battle, which I consider to be one of the best fight scenes in the show. Skipped. Episode 14 and 15. These episodes separately cover the brothers meeting Dr. Marco and the first big battle against Scar, and are moved to episodes 5 and 6. Episodes 16 and 17. The brothers return to their hometown to get fixed up after their battle with Scar and meet with family friends Pinako and Rinri. It's a calm respite from the big action of the previous episodes, and there's a number of small, touching personal moments. The events are condensed into episode 6. Episode 18. The brothers review Dr. Marco's research and learn how a Philosopher's Stone is made. Moved to episode 7. Episodes 19 through 22. Ed and Al infiltrate the secretive 5th laboratory. The events are mostly condensed into a single episode, and everything after Ed fights the hollow armor is removed. Episodes 23 and 24. Ed recovers in the hospital and Al has his identity crisis. The events are condensed into episode 9. Episode 25. A number of events occur, most importantly the death of Hughes. Moved to episode 10. And lastly, episodes 26 through 28. Various events take place, notably the brothers meeting their alchemy teacher Izumi, which are moved to episodes 11 through 12. While some later story elements do still overlap and some early ones differ, episode 29 is where I consider the stories to largely diverge. The problem isn't that Brotherhood omits these episodes, especially since some of them aren't from the manga. The problem is that Brotherhood doesn't replace them with anything. The early episodes set up world building and challenge the characters with moral dilemmas and emotional hurdles to overcome. Events that were given room to breathe in the original series are rushed through as fast as possible. In the 2003 show, there's a significant amount of time devoted to showing Ed and Al's early life with their mother. She falls ill, delivering some final heartfelt words to her sons on her deathbed. In Brotherhood, there's a single 45-second scene between the boys and their mom before Ed states in voiceover that she died off-screen. In the original series, the brothers spend a lot of time studying for the state alchemist exam. Moments are devoted to showing their anxiety and the pressure they're under. In Brotherhood, Ed passes the exam in 2 minutes of screen time without any build-up. This kind of rushed, lackadaisical storytelling pervades nearly every scene in the early parts of Brotherhood. I wish Studio Bones had put the same time into the early episodes as they did with the first show. However, things change dramatically once the stories diverge. Suddenly, Brotherhood slows way down, to the point where it actually becomes too slow. Events seem not to matter and take far too long to progress. It's a slog to sit through. Strangely, it feels like Brotherhood suffers from classic adaptational problems, as though the story were being crafted with filler anime original content in an attempt to not overtake source material, even though that's not the case. Brotherhood's mid to late episodes are bloated with pointless events and excess characters. The main antagonist, Father, is confronted midway through the series, and it feels like everything between that moment and the ending is the show stalling. Nothing that happens in the interim is necessary for the heroes to face him. The story meanders and events feel like they're happening without purpose. For example, Sloth arrives in a northern border outpost by accident and fights the personnel there. He's defeated only to be released from his confinement shortly thereafter. A separate form of alchemy called alkahestry is introduced, but it seems irrelevant. It's shown that alkahestry can heal injuries, which robs the tension from the fight scenes when you know that mortally wounded characters can potentially be healed. There are many characters who could have been cut out of the story without issue. This includes 4 different unaffiliated Chimera soldiers who initially worked for the antagonists before switching sides, multiple foreign royals from the eastern nation of Zing, and General Armstrong's subordinates. Poor story direction and a lack of subtlety abound everywhere. When the homunculi gather together, it's mentioned that Sloth is absent. Then, before you have any time to wonder what the mysteriously absent Sloth could look like, the show immediately cuts to an image of him. It does the same for Hohenheim. In the original show, when the homunculi go to destroy Dr. Marco's research, they engage in a battle with Scar, which unintentionally winds up burning down Central Library. In Brotherhood, Lust talks about burning the library off-screen instead of seeing it.
めんどくさいから建物ごと燃やしちゃった。
セントラルで何してきたの？
だから今説明してるでしょ。
Both shows utilize gag humor, where characters are drawn in a chibi art style. I'm usually not a fan of this type of humor, but it can sometimes work depending on context. But whereas the original show was reserved with its use, Brotherhood uses it constantly. It happens so often that the show undercuts serious scenes by punctuating them with inappropriate gag bits. When the heroes are being chased by the terrifying and monstrous gluttony, the suspense is shattered by a chibi gag.
こんなものまで作り出すのか錬金術を使えねえなだったら君が何とかしてみせろっていうかついてこないでよあいつが狙ってるのは大佐
When Hughes and Roy speak about the Ishbalan genocide, the moment is broken by a chibi gag.
目つき変わっちまったな。
そういうお前もな、人殺しの目だ。
グレイシアって言うんだ。セントラルでずっと俺の帰りを待っててくれてる。
When Maria Ross has to decide whether to remain in prison and be executed on false charges or escape and appear guilty, bringing shame to her family, the moment cuts to a chibi gag.
選びな。このまま殴り殺しにされるか、俺と一緒に逃げるか、二つに一つだ。
最悪だ。それ以外に選択肢はないの。
ないみたいだよ
The show has a character named Mei Chang, an underage foreign warrior princess with a cutesy undersized panda animal sidekick. And then there's this bit.
会いたかったわ。じゃあ。
ウロボロスの入れ墨だぞ。
俺も今知りましたよ。
騙しててごめんなさいね。
大好きっす。ボインボインボイン。
The often serious and dramatic tone clashes against the goofy humor. The show wants to be taken seriously but undercuts its own tone. The show's themes are also undercut by softening characters and events. In the original, Winry's parents are killed by Roy, who was ordered to do so because as doctors in the Ishbalan War, they were treating anyone without discriminating between sides and thus, in the military's eyes, aiding the enemy. This creates tension because Roy is shown to have a direct hand in harming characters we know and because Winry thinks of him as a good man, but is torn after learning about his actions. In Brotherhood, Winry's parents are killed by Scar, essentially at random, which carries no tension because Scar is already an antagonist and the enemy of Ed and Al, and because the motivations for him doing so are less interesting. In Brotherhood, Ed has a conversation with Major Miles, where Ed argues that he doesn't want to kill anyone. Miles retorts that that's the naive thinking of a child, that hesitation and an unwillingness to kill will lead to the enemy killing you and your friends first. This is contradicted when Roy and his subordinates initiate a coup without killing anyone and are successful, but then it's contradicted again because their northern allies, who are also supposed to be the good guys, do kill their enemies. Ed is presented with a moral dilemma. Al is gonna die, but Ed can use a Philosopher's Stone to save him. Ed rejects this because he promised Al he wouldn't use human lives, but the stone is already crafted, no one new is being harmed by using it, and there's no way to undo the sacrifices. Hohenheim offers to sacrifice his own life to save Al, which I thought would have been a fitting ending for his character, the absentee father who dies to save his son. But Ed rejects this as well, even though Hohenheim winds up dying from age soon after anyway. Roy and Lieutenant Havoc are both disabled, with Roy becoming blind and Havoc becoming a paraplegic. Yet Roy chooses to use a Philosopher's Stone to heal their conditions. Morally unacceptable for Ed, yet somehow fine for Roy. Brotherhood frequently contradicts its own message. In the original show, Ed and Al are forced to make meaningful sacrifices to save each other. Ed is stranded in another world, unable to use alchemy, and Al loses his memories. In Brotherhood, Ed sacrifices his ability to use alchemy. In the original show, Hohenheim is directly responsible for creating the first Philosopher's Stone with Dante, making him a mass murderer. In Brotherhood, he's unaware of Father's plans and is essentially a victim. Brotherhood wants to have things both ways. It wants to tackle mature themes without saying anything questionable, and it wants to have morally complex heroes but without them being too objectionable. In the original 2003 show, the homunculi are a combination of sinister villains and tragic characters. Created from failed human transmutations, they are the legacies of their human creators, monuments to hubris, who have returned to haunt their former family. They contain some wisps of their original selves, but have mostly become twisted and lost. In Brotherhood, they're one-dimensional henchmen, heartless, bloodthirsty monsters with no personality beyond being evil and sadistic. Ed asks why they follow Father when he treats them as disposable pawns, but receives no answer. The original Sloth was an interesting character, with unique powers and a compelling dynamic between herself and the Elric brothers, who are conflicted about fighting her. In Brotherhood, Sloth is an unthinking brute who punches people. The original Wrath is a tragic character with connections to Ed and Izumi. In Brotherhood, his equivalent character, Pride, is an uncaring monster who kills people because he's told to or because he can. In the 2003 series, fight scenes usually take place between characters who have some emotional connection or ideological conflict. In the instances where they don't, the show works to create one. Characters fighting those whom they're connected with or with opposing ideologies is interesting. In Brotherhood, fights often take place between random, unconnected characters with no emotional stakes. Heroes fighting nameless zombies or mute mercenaries is not compelling. I didn't care who would win the fight between Bradley and Greed because the characters have no connection with each other and the outcome didn't matter. In the 2003 show, the fight between Ed, Al, and Sloth is very compelling because they have a history and connection with each other. Al is even so opposed to fighting Sloth that he actively interferes with Ed. I didn't care about Brotherhood's fight between Armstrong and New Sloth because again, the characters have no connection and Sloth is just a mindless brute. No personal drama or conflicting ideologies, just fighting. Characters sometimes stand around and talk to enemies they have no reason to when they should be fighting.
鋼の何やら新しい仲間も増えているようだが
無駄話は後でしろ戦え
しかし懐かしい場所だな注意君の泣き顔が思い出される
無駄話は後でしろ戦え
またああいう素直な涙を見たいものだ
水分は大嫌いなんじゃないですか無能になるから
無駄話は後でしろ
In the 2003 series, the military is influenced by the homunculi and the schemes of Dante, but while they've exerted their influence, especially with the current Führer being a secret homunculus, they are by no means in complete control of society, nor solely responsible for the events that have transpired. The homunculi may have manipulated events according to their plans, but ordinary humans are still largely responsible for killing civilians, human experimentation, and other war crimes. In Brotherhood, the military and nation are entirely co-opted by the homunculi and Father and have been from the beginning, which somewhat absolves the humans of responsibility. In the original 2003 series, the ominous doorway of truth is a mysterious presence that we never fully understand. We don't know what it is, why it acts, or if it even has a will. In Brotherhood, it's represented by a physical being who speaks to other characters and seems to have a mischievous personality. It's tangible, which robs it of its mystery. The 2003 series ends without tying up all the loose ends. The remaining homunculi have lost their leader and original purpose, but they aren't gone and could still pose a threat. The two brothers are separated from each other, with Ed being trapped in a different world. Things are imperfect, bittersweet, and end on a feeling of hope that Ed and Al will persevere until they're reunited. Brotherhood ends with a ridiculous, over-the-top video gamey boss battle where all the heroes spam their highest MP attacks against the villain's force field in a scene that feels like it's straight out of an RPG. In the 2003 series, the relationship between Ed and his childhood friend Winry is understated and can't be easily labeled. They're neighbors, friends, and feel like extended family or perhaps siblings. They have some kind of bond and care about each other, but not in any clearly definable way. Any romantic possibilities are never acted on considering they're young and often separated. It's different from the stereotypical romance plots found in most stories, and I liked it a lot. Brotherhood makes their relationship explicitly romantic and includes this incredibly cringy line from Ed. Finally, music plays an enormous role in evoking emotion in the listener. If you take a scene and strip away its music, the feelings are lost. The original 2003 series has music that I still listen to this day, independent of the show, and the songs are fantastic. It has memorable tunes that set the mood for many different tones depending on the scene. Brotherhood's soundtrack is quite extensive, and while not bad, a lot of the songs sound like generic movie score. None of the songs capture the same emotion or memorability, and I can't hum any of them from memory. Additionally, a few of the songs are quite bad. With all that being said, if you personally like or prefer Brotherhood, or enjoyed both shows, that's great. I mean that genuinely. Many of the problems I have with the show are definitely a matter of personal preference and not objective quality. Personally, it didn't affect me the same way the 2003 series did, and I often felt bored. The original series is emotionally powerful, thematic, morally complex, masterfully crafted, and I was far more engaged. If you enjoyed this video, you can subscribe to my channel to be notified of future videos. I'm just starting out as an online content creator, so I welcome any and all feedback regarding improvements I can make for future videos. Thank you for watching.